We're bringing healthy back. Them other bros don't know about the facts.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Magic of Metabolic Health podcast, where optimizing your metabolic health is our goal, and we are here to get you there. My name is Amelia, and I am a food first personal trainer and metabolic health coach, and this is my esteemed colleague and co-host.
Hi, my name is Dr. Fumi Aoyami. I'm a board certified internal medicine hospitalist with specializing in metabolic health. How you guys doing? Welcome back. Glad to see you guys. So here at the Magic of Metabolic Health podcast, we are building a village that encompasses every part of who you are. We release guilt and shame and the quest for perfection, and instead we show you how to manage self-efficacy and knowing your why. These are crucial tools in sustainable behavioral change and optimizing your metabolic health. So now that we're here, let's get started. Today is episode 9. Amelia, tell us about it.
Yes, yeah. So today we have the pleasure of interviewing my father, Michael Wood. Hi,
That's right.
Dad.
Hi,
I also call him Dad. Hi, Dad.
my second daughter.
Yes. So I'll introduce you a little bit. Michael is a health industry veteran consultant and entrepreneur of over 30 years in the employee and patient health improvement segment, serving large employers, health plans, and healthcare providers and systems.
Wonderful.
In 1983, he co-founded CareWise, developing the first commercial health advocacy nurse line, which was combined with biometric testing, health risk appraisals, blood pressure control, self-care books, wise buying of healthcare education, and wellness. Michael was instrumental in the formation of the first Health Case Managers Association and pioneered the development of early condition management programs. He is seen as an industry visionary with practical execution capabilities and is often quoted in the national media and sought after by many consumer health service companies for advice and strategic counsel. He retired from the corporate consulting world in 2015 and continues to consult privately with different organizations with a focus on metabolic health.
Wonderful. That's quite the rap sheet, I'm telling you. I didn't know
Yeah,
it's
so
been 20
welcome
years
to the
since.
Magic of Metabolic Health podcast, Michael.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is really exciting. I did want to say too that you were instrumental in helping Fumi and I formulate this idea for a podcast, and
Sure.
you were helping us with, concepts and, our target audience and, our goals and objectives and things like that. And so now we've made it this far to episode 9. So I am very honored and excited to have you here. And I guess we'll just get started with our first question. Fumi, you want to hit it off?
Sure. Absolutely. So it's only right for us to bring you back because honestly, the way your mind works is part and parcel of like what brought the magic of metabolic health together. It makes me kind of wonder how your childhood was, like how you got started in this journey of metabolic health. Like, what was your childhood like the foods and activities that you did, and the things that like your family valued.
Well, I grew up in the Midwest in a small town called Batavia, Illinois, outside of Chicago,
Oh, okay.
and kind of had a Leave It to Beaver experience in the 50s and the early 60s. 5 brothers and sisters, so we were a big family.
Wow.
And we were eating kind of traditional 50s food. We would have, for dinner, we'd have meat, potatoes, vegetable, and a salad typically. And we have dessert sometimes, not every time, because we were just too many kids. But I was also brought up with breakfast cereals and white bread. And I drank way too much sugary stuff and ate too many candy bars and penny candy and ended up with a mouthful of cavities. Thankfully, my mom had us go to the dentist twice a year. And, I had many cavities filled because of all the sugar I ate when I was a kid. But I was also very active physically, into sports, and swimming and baseball, football, basketball. So the interesting thing about that in hindsight is that we were told as kids that we shouldn't eat butter anymore and that we should eat margarine. So my mom served imperial margarine, and she used Crisco and Wesson oil to cook instead of lard or butter. Same with my grandma. They even convinced her to do her fried chicken in Crisco instead of lard. So hindsight 2020, it would have been nice to know that those weren't the right things to do as we know today. So that's kind of my roots, but my kind of revelation and understanding of metabolic health came much later in my life. As a matter of fact, it was in about 2014 is when I kind of had my eyes opened.
Oh, wow.
Cool. Well, we're gonna get there because that is a really intriguing and interesting part that I want you to share with our audience. But I kind of want to go a little bit in chronological order. So from your childhood, right? You were active, you played outside a lot. I know my grandparents, your parents, they were avid gardeners, so they had lots of fresh, organic produce before it was trendy and popular. They fed you guys really well from the garden. And so I was wondering, I don't know if I ever asked you this, but how did your childhood influence your career path or like what you decided to do in college and focus on? Because I'm curious about that. So if you want to share.
Well, I was always interested in athletics and health because of the kind of the way I was brought up. We paid a lot of attention to eating right and exercising. I mean, we had the Presidential Fitness Awards back in the day. So it was just kind of a part and parcel of growing up and in my family. And then, so when I went to college, I had to decide what I wanted to major in. And at the time, I was interested in being a coach, a coach of basketball specifically.
Oh, wow.
But I also liked health so much that I minored in health. So I was a physical education major, but ended up being more of a health major as time went on. And got my bachelor's degree in health and physical education, and then went on and got 2 master's degrees in health and health education.
Early beginnings, nice.
Curious, so back then, a degree in health was different than a degree in nutrition, right? So,
yes,
like, how much nutrition did you learn about? Was that a focus, or was your health education more about physical activity or other things?
We didn't know buckus about nutrition in the 70s. We knew
Not
nothing.
Thank goodness.
Matter of fact, in 1975, when I was at the University of Michigan, I one time kind of was contemplating my navel and said, I don't know anything about nutrition. I should take an introduction to nutrition class. So I went to the catalog and found the lowest level nutrition class I could find at the Masters of Public Health School, enrolled and went to the first class. And there was a professor, and he just started putting hexagons on the board with C's and H's and O's and lines between them and talking about polysaccharides. And, I sat through that first session, and it was all just biochemistry. And I could tell from the syllabus that we were never going to get to what should we eat, what's healthy, what's not healthy, what promotes health, what is detrimental to health. And so I disenrolled. I dropped the class and found out later that until 1980, the federal government never really said anything about nutrition. Oh, wow. And I think there might have been one nutrition course in my undergrad offering, but I didn't take it. And I don't know what they would have been teaching at that point anyway. So it's interesting what a vacuum there was in the 60s and 70s until U.S. came out with its dietary guidelines in 1980, which ended up being an unmitigated disaster of a set of guidelines leading to the current obesity rates and diabetes rates and metabolic health problems.
Wow. To
Yeah,
sum it up.
so I guess that kind of segues into my next question is, once you left college, how were your views on nutrition and health in general? Like, I guess, again, hindsight, without judging, what were your values, as a person who has a master's degree in public health?
Well, I started out working in public health, and our mantra was to be evidence-based and to follow the science. So when the science started coming out in the 80s, the science said eat low fat, and avoid saturated fat, and then eventually, and then kind of eat whole grains, and eat lots of whole grains. The first recommendations came out. There was like saying to eat up to 11 servings of grains a day, i.e.,
11
11.
servings.
Yes. So bread,
Wow.
pasta, bagels, oatmeal, um, potatoes, all those types of things. And so, and then, use low fat margarine that's, got water beaten into it and, has no saturated fats. Use Crisco, use Wesson oil, corn oil, soybean oil.
Like the worst thing
And
for you.
so that was what everybody thought was the correct way to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And to eat, minimal amounts of meat, and don't eat eggs because they quote unquote raise cholesterol, which was the belief at the time, an unfounded belief. And so that's kind of what everybody did. And so I followed the low fat diet just like everybody else, because that's what the government said, and that got trickled down to what is taught in schools and in provided in hospitals and the armed forces and prisons and senior centers and daycare centers, all trickled down to those were the guidelines. And the interesting thing is when they reduced fat in everything, when the companies who produce packaged foods were told to reduce their fat, well, the food tasted insipid and terrible. So what did they do? They
Increase the
added
sugar.
mainly sugar. So, yogurt, instead of being whole milk yogurt, was skim milk yogurt, but they had to dump a bunch of sugar in it to make it be palatable. So consequently, everybody's carbohydrate intake went through the roof, from 1980 forward.
Whew.
Wow. So around that same time, you were working in public health, I believe, at the Department of Public Health in Montana. And in 1983, we mentioned in your bio, you started your own business. So I'm curious, you think I would know these answers, but I don't remember you ever telling me, why did you shift from working for the Department of Public Health to starting your own business? What were some of the catalysts influencing you?
Well, our task as a public health department was to improve the public's health. And when we looked at what the problems were, they were metabolic health problems. They were heart disease, cancer, strokes, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, diabetes, things like that. So we looked at the health department at implementing programs to detect those risk factors and then educate people on how to make changes, so that they could be healthier. So we would do health risk assessments, including blood tests with cholesterol and blood sugar, and then blood pressure measurements, and then physical fitness indicators, things like that, and then coach people on how to make lifestyle changes especially if they had a disease like heart disease or COPD. We were doing classes for people with heart disease and COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And when we were doing these programs, we were asked by the school district and the city and the county to do them for their employees. So we had contracts between the health department and these government employers and a couple of private employers as well to do these health risk assessments and coaching and lifestyle change programs and blood pressure control. And we got money for that. It was a contract between us, the health department and these entities. So we were doing this for a year or two, and my partner, David Pfeffer, and I looked at each other and said, if we left the health department, there's a business here. So in 1983, we resigned from the health department and started our first company called Health Incentives, which eventually became the company called CareWise. And we took those concepts of health assessments and coaching and advocacy and made them into a private company, and then sold that concept to private businesses around Montana, like the Montana Power Company was one of our first big clients.
And I imagine there was nothing remotely similar to what you were doing. So how did you convince people to hire you? What got them on board?
Well, we went to the research literature and showed them that, people with heart disease and cancer and strokes and high blood pressure and all that, what were the risk factors that were causing those, and that we were going to help people understand those risk factors, identify them in themselves, give them tips and coaching for behavior change so that they could change those risk factors and reduce the incidence of those diseases, which means that they would reduce the cost of healthcare for those companies. So all those the companies were all self-insured. So if they saved a heart attack, they saved $50,000.
Okay. So you tied it back to the money to make sure that the companies understood that by doing these healthcare assessments for their employees, they were in the long run saving money.
Right. And then teaching them to advocate for themselves and to seek healthcare appropriately at the same time. So we gave out self-care books, and we did training of people to figure out when you should think about going to the doctor versus not. And if you go, what questions you should ask, which is how we invented the notion of the patient advocate service, was nurses on phones 24 hours a day, helping coach people both on lifestyle and if they had to go to the doctor for something, to advocate for themselves, to become an informed consumer and make informed choices, a kind of shared decision making, if you will, between the person and the doctor, which was a new concept. And we had to convince corporations that was a good thing to do, and we also had to have the doctors on our side, which they largely were. Informed patients provide better care to themselves, and the doctors are able to do a better job if people are informed and bought in.
That's excellent. It's a model that we still use today. Informed, having patients that know how to advocate for themselves, make them better patients now, and it makes the doctor-patient relationship much, much better. So thank you for your work. You're about 4 decades ahead of our time, and it all started with incentives like yours. I guess the thing that makes me wonder is what was the aha moment that brought the biggest transformation in understanding metabolic health, your health in general, because you're so steeped inside these programs, but how did it personally affect you?
Well, it took a long time. I kind of bought the traditional public health research that was done, using statistical analyses of large populations correlating saturated fat with heart disease, and certain foods with cancers and all those types of things. And we just, went with whatever the evidence said. My big wake-up call was in 2014 when I was sitting in the dentist chair, and my dentist said to me, Michael, your gums bleed more than they should when I clean your teeth. And I said, but I floss, I brush, I have fastidious dental hygiene. And he looks at me and he says, well, what's your blood pressure? What's your hemoglobin A1C score? What are you doing about your diet? So he said, read this book. And he gave me the title of this book called Good Calories, Bad Calories, which is by an author, an investigative health reporter named Gary Taubes. And it's basically a critique of nutrition science over the last 100 years. And he found that a lot of the research was ill-conceived, weak, even contradictory, and often false or biased because of the funding sources that were typically commercially influenced funding sources.
Absolutely.
So I read this book, and it basically said this whole thing with low fat, high carb is not really based in science. No one has ever been able to show that saturated fat is causative with heart disease. As a matter of fact, the American College of Cardiology just 2 years ago came out again and reaffirmed that that saturated fat is not correlated with heart disease in any way, shape, or form, which most cardiologists don't know. The thing that happened to me was I went and took my blood pressure and had my HbA1c run. My blood pressure was 140 over 90, which is borderline, right?
Sure, consider it.
I weighed 212 pounds. When I graduated from high school, I weighed 170. My HbA1c was 6.3, which is pre-diabetic. So I said, well, I guess I better read this book. So I read this book, and it rocked my world. It turned my whole way of thinking upside down from what I had been taught for 20 years and believed to be true, and found out most of it was false and was predicated on ill-conceived concepts and bias,
Sure.
and even corruption in research. For example, Harvard was paid by the Sugar Institute to clear sugar as a cause of any kind of metabolic disease and blame it on saturated fat.
There's an article about this. We need to link this because this has been something that has been brought up again and again and again in the metabolic circles. We have to link this article because this is a big issue.
Yeah, it was William Stair was the primary investigator at Harvard, and it was found that he and his colleagues received equivalent of $50,000 from the Sugar Institute to do this research to basically, make sugar innocent and blame heart disease on saturated fat. And there was a guy in England named, his name just escaped me. But there was kind of a contrarian that said, no, sugar is really more of a problem than fat. And he was vilified and didn't receive credibility. And it turns out he was right. If I think of his name, I'll mention it later.
We'll have to link that too.
Yeah. So there was that all going on. And the Ansel Keys studies, the 7-country study that correlated low meat intake with low heart disease rates, low saturated fat with low heart disease. It turns out he cherry-picked the 7 countries that he picked. He left off the ones that had high saturated fat intake and low heart disease rates, like France and Germany, who ate butter and sausages. And they had low heart disease rates, but he left them off of his studies and said, well, these other 7 countries have low fat diets and they have low heart disease rates. Ergo, high saturated fat causes heart disease. So we labored underneath that ill concept for many years. So and since then, there's over 100 trials, randomized control trials, showing that low carb, moderate to high fat, higher protein diets are much more metabolically healthy than low-fat, high-carb diets.
Wow.
So they're more effective at losing weight. They're more effective at lowering blood sugar. As a matter of fact, the American Diabetes Association has even come out and said that the most effective way to control glycemic load or glycemic status is a therapeutically low carbohydrate diet. The problem is
Sure.
they don't put it on page 1 of their website. They put it on page 157 or whatever the number is, because they're sponsored by drug companies. And if they come out and say, well, you can reverse your diabetes if you just change your diet, the drug companies aren't going to like that. And so they're under financial pressure to not push that. I mean, I've even seen recipes from one of their sponsors, which is a kidney dialysis company, put out a recipe for cucumber salad, and it had vinegar and salt and cucumbers and a quarter of a cup of sugar in it. This
Mm.
is a recipe endorsed by the American Diabetes Association with sugar. So all that to be said, that I was totally uninformed for many years, and finally in 2014, when I had a health problem that I needed to address, including I had a detached retina that was caused by a surgeon.
Oh, wow.
I went cold turkey, low carb in July of 2014, and lost 30 pounds.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
Lowered my A1C from 6.3 to 5.7. My blood pressure dropped to 110/70. And I got rid of my GERD, my gastroesophageal reflux disorder, lost 3 inches off my waist, and several other things, lost skin tags. I went from needing 3 dental checks-up a year to needing only 1 dental checkup per year. So that kind of, my little n=1 experiment convinced me to look into this further and to see what does the research say about this versus, low fat, high carb ways of eating.
Honestly, you've got the mental fortitude to do this kind of thing, because all the symptoms that you were able to remove completely are some of the big benefits of low carb, keto, carnivore diets, losing the weight and reversing diabetes and GERD and this, fat, obesity associated syndromes, and, reducing your A1C, reducing your blood pressure. These have all been described in these studies, and most doctors know this, but there's always a kind of pushback from doctors and patients alike that a lot of people can't continue these diets, that these diets are fad diets. It can only be done for 1, 2, maybe at most a year before you fall back into the same diet that you had before, that people are stuck in their ways, that forcing people to, or recommending to do this type of diet for a long term is inconceived or improbable. As in, what do you say to that?
Show me the research
Hmm.
that proves that.
I actually really like that.
I've
Put
had
your money
doctors,
where your mouth is.
I've had doctors say to me that, well, that's not sustainable. Okay, well, show me the research study that proves that. And blank stares.
Of course,
Um,
always.
as a matter of fact, I think one of the best studies out there is the Virta Health study, VIRTA Health, did a 5-year diabetes reversal study.
Hmm.
And somewhere between 60 and 80% of the people enrolled in that program have maintained normal blood sugar and gotten off of insulin.
It's excellent.
So that's better compliance than people get with a lot of medications. A
Hmm.
lot of medication. 25% of all medications prescribed aren't even filled. So don't talk to me about sustainability. And then people go off their blood pressure medications because they have side effects.
Sure,
Don't
of
tell me
course.
don't tell me again that that's sustainable.
That doesn't seem sustainable either, does it?
So it is sustainable. It's a matter of support, coaching, cognitive behavioral therapy, supportive families, reorienting one's whole life and kind of point of view, getting the bad stuff out of your pantry. Now we live in a toxic food environment where 70% of the groceries that you see in the grocery store are ultra processed foods, and they're screaming at you, even at Home Depot, to grab that candy bar.
So you've told us a lot about the different metabolic conditions and what you had thought about things like leading up to your aha moment. But were there any signs and symptoms that you had prior to your aha moment that kind of clued you in that something was amiss?
There were some subtle things. I had heartburn, and I thought it was from pizza. And so I would try different toppings, like, is it the green peppers? Is it the pepperoni? Is it the tomato sauce? What is it? Well, turns out it was the dough. So now if people serve pizza, I just scrape the top off, eat that, and then throw the dough away. So that was one sign and symptom that I had that something was metabolically wrong. Another one that I had that I thought at the time was metabolically wrong. Turns out it was not metabolically a problem. And that was, I was told I had high cholesterol. And my cholesterol was only like 230 at the time. But those were the days when anybody who had a cholesterol of 230 or above was recommended to automatically go on a statin. And this is probably in the late 90s. And so I first tried Metamucil, because I had read about an Indian study that showed that men who took Metamucil every day lowered their cholesterol. And then I even tried there's another natural cholesterol herb that I tried for a while. So anyway, and then I went on a statin for a year or two. And then my daughter was bugging me about it and said, do you really need to take that? Have you looked into how sugar might affect your cholesterol? And I kind of poo-pooed that because, again, the research showed sugar was a harmless, empty calorie. That was the official research position
at the time.
And actually, it's just now being refuted in the last couple of years.
Wow.
So anyway, at some point, I just decided I don't want to take this stuff. I don't have a statin deficiency, so I just went off it. I just had read, about side effects, and so I went off. Fast forward to 2014, when I read Good Calories, Bad Calories, and also Nina Teicholz's book, The Big Fat Surprise, and had read about a high cholesterol, and it turns out that high cholesterol is way overdiagnosed and way overtreated, and that it only works or is beneficial to a very small slice of people. And it's primarily people who've had heart disease, who've had heart attacks, okay? As a general preventive measure where you haven't had any signs or symptoms of heart disease and you take a statin, it only confers benefit on 1 out of 220 people.
Sure.
So you have to treat 220 people to have one person have avoid a non-fatal heart attack. Okay. So those aren't very good odds. If I had cancer and somebody offered me a drug that only worked in 1 in 220 people and had side effects, I probably wouldn't take it. Would you? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So then I looked into, okay, if I take the statin, what's the difference in mortality over the next 5 years? And the original Lipitor studies showed that the difference between taking a statin and not taking a statin over a 5-year period was the difference between 97% survival and 98% survival. So people who took statins were 98% still alive after 5 years. People who didn't take statins, 97% were still alive. All-cause mortality. Wow. So that's a 1% difference is all it is, absolute risk. But the drug companies take those numbers and make it into 30 or 45% relative risk difference.
Right.
So they manipulate the numbers and say, well, it's a 46% reduction. Well,
Sure.
that's when you take 100% minus 97, and then and just cook the numbers.
Sure.
So that kind of, and then I looked at, okay, what's the average life expectancy increase for a person who takes statins? 4 days.
Excuse me.
4 days.
I feel like I should know these numbers, and as in
Yeah.
I know the difference between absolute and relative risk, and I think we should actually do an episode on that, because when you're reading these articles, it's really hard to understand that 1% risk reduction and absolute risk reduction versus like one of 30% relative risk reduction, as in what do these numbers mean, and how does it like pertain to you as an individual looking at this. So I think these numbers can be deceiving, and you're right. A lot of pharmaceutical companies, food companies are taking those numbers knowing that people don't really know what it means.
Well, it's
So
not even
something to be addressed for sure.
Yeah, and most doctors don't know when it comes to statins. Many doctors don't know the difference between relative and absolute risk because they don't disclose it. They don't tell that to patients before they prescribe it and tell them, well, here's informed consent. It's going to reduce your risk by 1%. I have to treat 220 people like you in order to have one person benefit. When they've actually done an experiment of that, 40% of people decline the statin when they're told those things.
Sure.
So
in defense of the doctors, because I have to, right, as in a doctor here, a lot of our training, kind of goes through this algorithm of treating people when they come in with ACS, when they come in with, a lot of risk factors that could lead to ACS, which is acute coronary syndromes, heart attacks, strokes, angina, things like that. And so I do think that there should be better understanding between what these drugs do, the absolute and relative risk. And I do think that there should be a better model of asking patients, hey, this is the risk and these are what it can do. And, having a more informed consent about those things. So I do agree on that stance.
yeah. So for example, about 20% of people who take statins end up with muscle pain and stop taking it. And it increases your risk of developing diabetes. It increases insulin resistance. So if people know that, they may say, well, I'll try something else. And then the kicker to all this is the most recent studies of well people, okay, in their 60 and above, the higher your total cholesterol, the longer you live. Okay, wrap your head around that.
I need to see the study. I got to take a look at it. We're going to link all these studies. So in the bottom, we're going to link all these studies, all these articles, because it should be looked at. And we're also going to maybe do a video about how to interpret these studies for your own, edification, because I think that's good. That's good healthcare advocacy, being able to understand studies and being able to represent yourself appropriately when you talk to your doctor, when you, decide on what you want to take and what you don't want to take. I think that's all good.
There's a really good researcher that has done very deep dives on this, and his name is David Diamond. And if you go on YouTube and find David Diamond cholesterol, he has whole presentations on how the statistics are used and bent. What the real absolute benefits and risks and side effects are. So I'm not concerned about my cholesterol anymore. As a matter of fact, I'm what they call a lean mass hyperresponder. My cholesterol actually went up when I went low carb. My LDL went up, my HDL went up, but my total risk went down. So by a lot, because of my controlled blood pressure and controlled HbA1c, much more important than LDL in terms of total risk. So, look up David Diamond, and maybe you guys could even interview him sometime. I know him personally, and I'm sure we could get him.
I would love that. That would be fantastic.
Yeah, you should have a whole episode just on the whole controversy of cholesterol. 75% of people admitted to the hospital for a heart attack. 75% of people admitted had at or below target LDL levels.
Hmm.
So explain that. If high cholesterol, high LDL is causative, how come 75% of people who have heart attacks have low LDL cholesterol?
Listen, causative is a hard word. I would say a risk factor for sure, as in because I believe that when we're I believe that when we try to reduce the cholesterol in people who do have heart attacks, as in the idea is to stabilize cholesterol plaques, prevent them from further rupturing, and so that's why I said that statins should be used in a certain population of people, but I don't think it's a cure-all for every single person in the population. And finding out who those people are specifically is what's important. Otherwise, we're going to have this unnecessary sequela of, increased diabetes, cognitive issues in people who probably don't benefit it or only benefit it the 1%, the 97 to the 98%. And so I think this is a good conversation to have, and I'm happy that we're having it.
Mm-hmm.
I have one more question in relationship to your aha moments, Michael, and how maybe I know personally because I was around when you kind of realized that you were hoodwinked for decades and you were sharing the information that was hoodwinking you with colleagues, clients, family, friends. And I would love for you to share your story about the apology letter that you shared publicly because it had nothing to do with legal, issues or liability. It was coming from a place of aha, like of transformation and discovery. So, can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. So I'm very active on Twitter, now X. And actually, there's lots of really good research information that flows through Twitter, along with all the garbage. But there's a lot of good things. And so I announced on Twitter a few years ago my formal apology to my colleagues and clients that I had misled them on what the research actually said when it came to nutrition and heart disease and cancer and strokes and et cetera, and that the low fat recommendations with 11 servings of carbohydrates was ill advised, and I apologize for having promoted that and exhorted people to look into the research that has been done in the last 10 years, especially with randomized controlled trials showing that low carbohydrate diets actually are safe and effective and work better than any kind of low fat, calorie restricted diet when it comes to weight loss, diabetes reversal, etc.
Great. Well, I remember reading that and I was not shocked, but I was impressed that you were in a place of humility in a way and
It was
also
embarrassing. It was embarrassing.
yeah, and now, you're still very active in trying to kind of reverse the misinformation that is still being perpetuated in mainstream media, in hospitals, in doctor offices, in clinics, in health and wellness circles, and coaching. I mean, it's still winning, and it's scary because one of the reasons why I think we started this podcast was to bridge the gap between the media, the research, and the people, just average Joe people, because it's so easy to get sucked into the clickbait and the headlines, and so says this, and so says that, and you don't question it because you're like, well, that journalist probably read some research papers and they're just summarizing them. Nobody, 9 times out of 10, nobody actually goes to the source and reviews the research and critically analyzes it for, unethical approaches or practices. There's a whole list of terms which I'll put in the notes as well, of how research is deemed ethical or proper, or following the rules of
Sure.
research.
Of course.
There's a guy that we saw at Low Carb San Diego, and Dad, you probably know his name. I know his face. I know his face, and he did a whole presentation on how you interpret, how to know if research is adequate, legit,
Sure, of
ethical,
course.
proper. And so anyway, I'll put a link in the notes about how to dissect and interpret research as well.
It's difficult
It can be.
because the main, the sources of information, like you said, Amelia, of CNN or Fox News or CBS or whoever, or the online news services, X causes cancer, Y causes heart disease, and this nutrient is a problem, or that nutrient isn't a problem. And it's usually, like you said, it's clickbait, and the journalists have, by and large, no qualifications to look at the research and see whether there was any kind of bias playing, B, whether there was a healthy, like any kind of healthy user bias, for example,
Sure.
where they don't control for the different confounding factors, or who funded the study. Was it funded by Big Food or Big Pharma?
Important.
Right. And whether the definitions of things are actually accurate. So, for example, when somebody comes out and says low carb diet doesn't work in this scenario, when you look at it, how they define a low carb diet is 150 calories or 150 grams of carbohydrates or less. Well, that's not a low carbohydrate diet. So they've misdefined what a low carbohydrate diet is to prove that low carbohydrate doesn't work. Okay, so there's things like that. So my advice is on most nutritional correlational studies that, like, for example, like Harvard does, and they come out and say X causes Y. That's the headline. What it usually means is X is associated with Y, but association does not mean causation. So I ignore all of the studies coming out of Harvard nutrition research. I ignore them. And Tufts, because all they're doing is taking this enormous database and crunching numbers and finding correlations, and correlation does not equal causation. And it's all based on inaccurate food frequency questionnaires. Fumi, tell me everything you ate last week. All right?
Impossible. I don't even know where I was.
That's what it's based on. And then a year later, they're going to say, okay, Fumi, tell me what you ate, everything you ate this past most recent week. And then
I still don't know. I still don't know.
So it's inaccurate. And so I don't pay any attention to the nutrition studies that come out unless they're a randomized controlled trial. Then I pay attention. So for example, when David Ludwig at Harvard does a study and he compares 500 people who are on a subcaloric low carb diet versus 500 people on a high carb subcaloric diet, and what happens to them over an 8-week period. And he shows that the low carb people in the subcaloric diet, it's below their basal metabolic rate. They lose twice as much weight as the people on a high carb subcaloric diet. And the people on the high carb subcaloric diet, their basal metabolic rate drops by 400 calories a day. So they're chasing their tail, right?
Sure, of course.
Even though you're only eating 1,500 calories a day, you've lost 400 calories of metabolic burn because of the high carb deficit diet versus the low carb deficit diet. The low carb deficit diet, the folks, their basal metabolic rate stayed the same. So it's studies like that I pay attention to. It's not that X, is associated with Y, or like, the WHO says meat causes colon cancer. Well, take a picture of a McDonald's Happy Meal, right? It's got 3 buns and 2 patties of burger and sauce on it that's made out of soybean oil and sugar, and then you've got French fries cooked in rancid seed oil, and then you've got a soft drink like Coca-Cola or Pepsi or something like that, and then a fried apple pie for dessert. And you take a picture of
Jesus.
that and you study it, and the WHO points at that and says meat causes colon cancer. That's how bad it
The
is.
the visuals, the
Yeah, right. I
visuals on
mean,
that one. My
it makes
goodness.
absolutely no sense, because when they study quote unquote meat eaters, that's what they eat in addition to the meat. They eat the French fries and the Coke and the
Mhm.
sauce and the
And the
ketchup, which is
bread.
50% sugar. So it's not an easy thing to do, um, ferreting out what's true and what's not true, what's good research and bad research. There's actually a whole book written, um, about the problems of research. It's called Science Fictions, and I just finished reading it a couple of weeks ago, and it points out all the problems of research and the perverse financial incentives that occur, and the paper mills that are around, that crank out papers just for the sake of cranking out papers so that they can get more research funding.
Yeah,
So
it's
it's
a big issue.
really a problem. It's
It's a big
really a
issue in
problem.
academics, like
Well, and
publish or perish, that kind of thing. We
publish or
got to
perish,
crank out this.
and then who's funding it? Pharma or
Yeah.
food? And of course, they don't publish the negative results. They don't
Mm.
publish the results that don't come out the way that the funder
Of
wanted.
course. This is very important in
Yeah.
publishing. The things that we assume that these are, they have to be linked. They have to be relative to each other. They must be associated with each other. They do a study and they find out that there's no association. No one publishes it. No one says that, hey, our study was a bust. Or we found that there was no actual causation, no correlation, or whatever the case may be. As in, that is just as important information as an actual correlation. That way that we can dispel these things that we think, oh yeah, it's cholesterol that's causing the issue. Actually, they did studies, it's not the issue. That needs to be told to the public also. Otherwise, we're going to continue to perpetuate these correlations that make no sense, or as in, we're going to keep thinking, oh, obviously chocolate causes acne, and as in, it could be anything else, but we don't dispel these things, and because we don't dispel them, they continue to perpetuate in our society. So that's very important. I love that you said that.
There was actually a famous study of the Women's Health Initiative where they didn't report that women who ate more polyunsaturated oils actually had a lower life expectancy. And they asked the authors 20 or 30 years later, when they found the data in a basement and reanalyzed it, they asked the authors, why didn't you publish the fact that women who ate soybean oil actually had a higher death rate than people who didn't, who continued to eat saturated fat? And they said, well, we were just so disappointed in the results
Oh wow, that's terrible. My
because it
God.
didn't fit the narrative that saturated fats being replaced by soybean oil was healthy. It didn't support that. And so they just didn't publish it.
This is wild. And the reason why is because the sequela of that, imagine having that type of research come out 40 years ago. Like what would what would the West look like? What would the health conditions look like? What would chronic diseases look like? What would metabolic disorders look like if we had more of this research 40 years ago that was actually published?
Yeah.
I can't even
Yeah.
say.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Speaking of 40 years, I actually had a question, Dad, to ask you. So, what are you doing now in your life that you never would have thought that you would do 40 years ago?
Mhm.
Um, well, I get more sleep than I thought I should have 40 years ago. So
Hmm.
sleep's pretty important to
What do
me.
you mean that you thought you should have?
Well, it was always kind of like, if you're young and healthy, if you only get 6 or 7 hours of sleep, it's not a big deal. And it turns it out it is a big deal. I function much better when I get 8 or 9 hours of sleep. So that I learned. And let's see, there was something else bouncing around in my head.
Well, I remember you saying how relieved you felt that you could eat butter again.
Yeah, it's really nice to not feel guilty or like I'm compromising my health by eating butter or having some bacon or eggs or whatever. So that's but then just as a practical matter, I always have had this love of scuba diving, which I started in earnest when I was 90 when I was about, how old was I? Well, it was 1991 when I really started scuba diving in earnest. I never would have dreamt that I would be able to go to the places I've gone and take the pictures underwater that I have. And one of my motivations of staying healthy is to be able to continue to scuba dive, because you have to be healthy to scuba dive. You have to pass a physical. You can't have a lot of conditions to scuba dive. So that's one of my big motivations. I never would have dreamt I'd be an underwater photographer.
I love that. That is knowing your why, which is
Yeah.
very important here at the magic of metabolic health. Knowing your why is one of the single driving forces in staying metabolically optimized and making sure that you're doing what's best for you. And I love that for you. I really do.
So to bring it home, I think the last question I would love for you to share is, what is your favorite meal?
Oh,
Probably a steak, a charcoal grilled steak. And I'm not fussy about what kind. I mean, sirloin or New York or ribeye. Ribeye's a little bit fatty for me, but a steak and some lightly cooked green beans, maybe a nice salad. Um, but yeah, a good steak. That's probably my favorite meal.
Nice.
okay. It's up there. It's up there for me.
Yeah,
I was like,
I'm all
that's
about the
good.
ribeye.
Oh, that's why when you said I'm not a fan of ribeye, I took that personally. I'm not gonna lie. I'm a big ribeye fan.
Yeah, I always want the ribeye. Give me
Mm,
all your fat. I will take the fat off his plate and
awesome.
take it for myself.
Me and you, Amelia, we're right here on the ribeye. Yes.
Hmm.
That's wonderful. No, Anzin, I'm glad that we're able to come and meet with you. This was an excellent interview. I feel like I really learned about like how things were and how things are and what the future of, low carb looks like. What's the future of having people more, metabolically optimized and I think that the future is bright.
Yeah, I'm hopeful, and but I think it's going to be from the bottom up, and because I think there's so much power and money trying to keep people to do what they're doing because it's so profitable.
Sure.
So people have to kind of take their own stand and say, I'm doing this for my health. They have to, like you said, they have to find their why,
Mm,
and they have to overcome whatever cravings they have. But I tell you, after a week or two, your taste for things like sweets or carbs has a tendency to go away for most people. So
that's right.
I'm hopeful that I think people can do this. And remember, we didn't. If you look at pictures from the 50s of people at the beach, we didn't have obesity rates like we do today. We didn't have diabetes rates like we have today.
No, it's
And
actually
it's because we
worse.
ate differently. We ate whole foods, and we didn't have as many highly processed, ultra processed foods available to us. So it can be done. We did it for hundreds of years, thousands of years.
Mm. Getting back to where we used to be, getting back to a healthier us, like as in I'm on board. I think we're all on board.
Mhm.
The question is, are you on board? That's
Yes,
to the viewers.
Mhm.
right. Well, that is a part and parcel of the magic of metabolic health is the food that we eat, the community that we're building, and I think we're at a good closing point. So I want to say thanks, Dad, for being part of this podcast that you really helped formulate. You were a big part of that. We appreciate you. I'm always knocking on the door, the text, the phone call, and email, like, hey, Dad, what do you think about this? Or do you know someone in this area that we can interview? Or, so I really appreciate you supporting the next generation of metabolic health practitioners and your two daughters who are just trying to figure it out as we go.
That's right.
Well, you are the future.
Thank you.
Little bit. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Please make a comment here if anything that we discussed resonated with you. We have a very long list of things that we have to put in the show notes. So if we forget or miss one talking point that Michael shared, please let us know, because we will get it and we will put it in there. We want to make sure that all of the wealth of information that he shared with us is available to you. Mm-hmm. So my name's Amelia, and this is Fumi Awayami and Michael Wood, and we are the magic of metabolic health. Thank you for being part of our village. Until next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
We're bringing healthy back. Them other bros don't know about the facts.